Thank you for tuning in for this author interview. My name is Adam Pelche, here representing the Windsor Public Library, and I have the honor of speaking with a local poet and writer, Vanessa Shields. She has written numerous books, and she actually has a brand new collection which will be released in April called Thimbles. And just before we do anything else, I'd like to hear something from the collection. And maybe if I could just get you to have a brief introduction of yourself and just say who you are for the audience.
Thanks for having me, Adam, and the Windsor Public Library team. Super happy to be here, and thanks for having this wonderful book talk series that you do. Super important and feels good for us authors to be recognized. So thank you. Yeah, so I'm a poet. I'm born and raised in Windsor. I've been writing poetry since I was a little kid, writing in a journal since I was a little kid. And this year I'm writing a poem a day. So by the end of the year, I will have 365 poems. So certainly poetry is a really important part of my life. And this new collection is called Thimbles. And it's about my relationship with my nonna, which is Italian for grandmother. And it's about her legacy and her life and our love story together.
Now, you actually have a selection from Thimbles that you would like to read to start off with. Before you begin, did you want to preface this poem with any information?
Sure. It's a little bit long, but it's one of the longer narrative poems, and it speaks to her beginnings in Italy, where she was born. She was born in a small town called Bassano del Grappa up in northern Italy, and it speaks to her sort of humble beginnings and what her life was like in that small town and when she began sewing. So the title is called Thimbles. And she was a brilliant seamstress, my grandmother. So there are many themes connected to sewing and sewing language throughout the book. And so this poem sort of gives her beginnings of where her sewing life came from. Her past unravels. I went to school until grade 5. I was 11. My mother told me I had to go with the nuns to learn how to sew. I didn't want to go. I could hear the other kids playing outside as I sewed day and night. I built a small room in a crumbling rectory attached to a shaken church for Nona's 11-year-old self to sew. She sits on a wooden school chair, the remnant of a wrinkled nun's gown resting on her kid-bruised knee, a needle threaded with skill, pulling up and pushing down, practicing the perfect base stitch. The nuns were 26. They were good to me. Soon we moved to a big room with 17 other girls in a proper sewing school. The first thing I made were pants for my father. They let us keep the patterns for the clothes we would have to make. I had to make coats. I was a full-time dresser. The room expands along with Nona's skills. Her body swivels from child to young woman. For 8 years, she works in the sewing school. My father would come home drunk and ask me why I was still going to the sewing school. Why was I still sewing for the nuns? She is talented, very talented, and motivated by love. She loves to sew, and she knows it as soon as the voices of the kids playing outside sift and blow away like flour. I got tips from the nuns, but I was to start working on my own before I was 18. Then when I started sewing on my own, the word spread how good I was. People from the mountains heard of me, people from our small town. Your nono, his family was talking about me. There is the absence of ego as she sews her beginnings. Traces of fear line her story like silk behind wood. I was making 1 to 2 outfits a week. It was hard during the war because I had to keep leaving to hide in the mountains. I had to keep stopping. But your nono, he lived close to me. I made him a nice blue top. My mother got me a uniform top from a commander in the Marines. I turned it inside out and made it like new for Nono. I sewed for his mother, his sister. She sews through a world war, thinks less of the bombs than the bobbins and basting, thinks about her heart reaching for my Nono, handsome, religious. Soon they will spend time alone together in the mountains. Nono stopped me while we were in the mountains. He said, "Stop right here." And he asked me, "Do I want to go out with him?" He said he'd ask my mother if I could date him. I can hear in her laugh all the unsaid. She loves him already. She makes him a beautiful shirt between bombings. While I was sewing in the mountains, he asked my mother if he could date me. When my father found out that we would be together, he was drunk. He called your Nono the wrong name, but Nono was too proud to say anything. His pride kept him away from me for 3 months. I watched him through my window while I sewed at home. Her cheeks burned with reignited anger and shame, with patience and unconditional love. Nono wanted to go to Canada. He'd already done his 15 months in the military. He didn't have a trade job, so he found work in a small ceramic factory making figurines. Then his ZIA sent for him from Canada. It would take 3 months to prepare the travel. That's when he asked my mother if he could marry me. We look at a black and white photo of Nona on a mountain top with her girlfriends. Her smile is bigger than the valley. I can see the mischief in her eyes. A wild young woman with shoulders square to the horizon, courageous and ready. The fear twisted threads blow away on the wind. He left and he wrote me 2 letters a week. They were beautiful and loving. I didn't take them with me because there wasn't room in my trunk, so I burned them. I willingly came to Canada because I loved him and it was the only way to have my life, to marry him. Before I can stop myself, I ask, "Did you have any other dreams for your life?" She squints. That's what life was for, to love, to be married, to make a family. There you go. That's one of the first poems from the beginning of the book.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Again, from the collection Thimbles, which is forthcoming to be released in April, so very soon, actually, right around the corner. Um, Now, maybe we can just give a little bit of information about this
Sure.
collection, because I believe this is the first collection of material that you've released since 2016, aside from your children's poetry collection from 2019.
Yes, so this has been a very long time coming. In September, so this fall, it'll be 3 years that we started working on this. I actually started working on the story about my grandmother's life and kind of finding out about who she was and learning about her history to write some personal essays that I then worked on at the Humber School for Creative Writing that I went to a course, a summer course that they have a few summers ago. And out of that came the birth of these poems. And I submitted it to a bunch of places and heard back from Palimpsest, which is a local Windsor press. And there were 3 sections in that, and the Nona poems were just a small section of that. And they said, "We'd love to publish it, but only the Nona stuff. So if you're into that, yes, but you're going to have to write a whole bunch more," which of course I was thrilled and excited and grateful. So really that was the beginning of it. But as far as what happened with my grandmother, so she was diagnosed with dementia um, probably about 3 years before she passed. And that was really about when I started writing and also started feeling this pull to need to get to know her in a different way. It's really incredible that you can have a grandmother or a parent or someone important in your life who you see and you know literally your whole life, but you really don't know that much about them outside of the interaction that you have and whatever the context of your life with them is. It's like your kids like not thinking that there was anything before them in your life. Like you're a mom and that's it. So I was really kind of compelled to learn more about my grandmother, especially because the disease of dementia essentially steals your memories away, right? And I wanted to be able to gather her legacy and gather her life story before any of those things disappeared. What's miraculous, however, is that she knew dates, she knew times, she remembered the name of the ship she came over on the boat, 60 years ago, and her deep far back memories were as fresh and beautiful as let's use an Italian metaphor, grapes on a vine. um, so I would just go to her house and sit beside her and interview her and take notes, and then I would make poetry out of that. And then as time progressed, she changed. The disease changed in her body. She aged quickly, and then the book sort of covers that too. So we get to learn about Nona's life, her childhood, where she came from in Italy, her immigration to Canada, her life as a mother and a wife and a grandmother, and then it kind of rolls into what the disease is doing to her. And we didn't know she was going to pass away before the book came out. And at the time, it was, of course, brutal to sort of go through that. But the poetry really helped me with the grieving process and helped me have a place to kind of put everything that I was feeling. So the third part of the book is after she passes, the poems completely change in style and in length. I felt like I had much less to say after she passed than, a 3-page poem that there was so much narrative to tell about her past and her life when she was alive. So the book is really one long conversation that I've had with my grandmother and my grief over, the last 3 years of her life.
And that gets me wondering, what sort of relationship did you have with your grandmother growing up? Were you close? Was writing this a response to want to be closer to her? What was your relationship like, basically?
Great question. So I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house. I was raised by an amazing single mom, and I have one sister. And my sister and I spent a lot of time at my grandmother's. Also, my grandfather was there too, and my aunt was at the house as well. So we're a super close knit family. Very traditional Italian family where everybody gets together every Sunday to eat this gigantic meal. Christmas is huge. You eat, you drink, you party all day and all night. And then all the cousins come over and you get drunk and you sing Italian songs. We sort of fell into that beautiful traditional Italian family. And she was really the matriarch of the family. Always in the kitchen, always cooking, always singing, always dancing, just sort of the light of the family. So as a child, she really was the one who taught me how to be free and laugh and sing and dance, and use my imagination and really love unconditionally. My nonna, if anybody came to the door for any reason, they came in, they got a hug, they could sit at the table and she'd cook them a meal. I mean, she just was bursting with love and light, unconditional all the time for everybody. So that's what I grew up with. However, when I became an adult and started to look at things a little bit differently, when I became a mother myself, you kind of pay attention to things differently. And, when I was aware that she drank a lot of wine and that she was an alcoholic and that alcohol played a big role in her life. I was aware that she was always sewing. The sewing machine was always on the kitchen table. We'd always have to heave it off to set the table and get ready, use the space for meals. And I just started to pay attention differently. And then especially when she got sick, like I said, I felt the sort of hammer of time coming down. Like, whoa, you better, get to know this woman as deeply as you can. And so that's when I decided to like make it official and get out my little journalism, notepad and start asking her specific questions about things that I'd heard. Like I knew she lost a son, her first child. Her or my nono got married and she got pregnant right away, and they had a son, but he passed away very soon from crib death, which is something that really doesn't happen anymore. And no one really talked about it. Yet we would go walk to the graveyard all the time together, and we would always stop at his grave. And as a child, I was just like having fun playing in the graveyard. But then as I looked back, I realized, wow, she was going to visit this beautiful little boy that she lost when he was 2 months old. Like, what does that do to a person? And, someone who's fresh off the boat, as they say, learning the language and having to reintegrate into this whole new life. And there's this huge loss. So I sort of rediscovered the stories that I'd heard growing up and just asked her as many questions as I could that I felt, comfortable asking her because I didn't want to make her sad or anything. Um, but really that changed the nature of our relationship too as well. And it absolutely brought us closer. And we had some incredible moments right up until, 2 days before she passed away when she was still able to speak. So
So, what was one of the most surprising or intriguing things you found out about your grandmother through these interviews?
that's a great question. I mean, she's really funny. She has a great sense of humor. She would, you know, throw out these hilarious lines, and every once in a while, just we would just have these laughing fits. And so I think I appreciated her sort of whimsy and her moxie and her lightheartedness despite some really difficult things that she was always going through. Um, and I think the other thing that I realized was that things that really angered me, I was very angry for the first 2 years of writing this. And many of the first iterations of the poems were just like angry, angry, grief wrapped in anger poems, which have since shifted out of that. But I think I needed to go through that. But I was very angry about a lot of things that were happening about around her, to her, with her care, in her house. But when I would sit down and talk to her about those things, they didn't occur to her. So all these things that I thought would anger her or confuse her or, would have this negative effect on her, she was just happy to be there. She was just happy to have her family around her. She was happy to have her glass of wine and watch Wheel of Fortune. And she really helped her sort of simply beautiful, unconditionally happy to be here sense of self and spirit right till the end. And that taught me a lot about her resilience and just the beautiful self that she was.
We're here with Vanessa Shields discussing her newest collection, Thimbles. As we're discussing, this has a lot to do with your relationship with your grandmother, as well as the aftermath of her passing. Um, I'm wondering if you could read another selection from the collection and
Sure.
maybe preface it, just explain a little bit of what we're going to hear.
Okay, so I'm going to read a poem that I wrote after she passed. I went to the graveyard and had breakfast with Nona. So I sat on the grassy knoll, the muddy knoll, and looked at her beautiful tombstone. Um, and I felt like I needed to be with her and see her. We had a pandemic funeral, which meant that everyone had masks on and there were all these rules, and it was very bizarre and really did a number on our grieving process. But anyway, I'm going to take you sort of right to the end of the book where I'm going to hang out with her at the graveyard. And then afterwards, I'll tell you more about the poem because I don't want to give anything away yet. Oh, and I should tell you that none of the poems really have titles because really this is, again, it's like a conversation that I'm having with my grandmother and with love and with life and with loss. So there really aren't titles. The titles are just the bolded first line. So a shirtless man with 1980s hair walks over to me as I sit in front of your tombstone. Who are you here for? He asks politely. My Nona. I point at her photo. Bees-on, he reads, pronounces Bees-on. He looks for her death date. She just passed. Oh, they haven't engraved the date yet? No. I remember when they were digging, he says. Cue my imploding heart. Bowing a little, my deepest sympathies. Thank you. And I bury my pain. I feel you smiling for summoning a shirtless man to your grave. So my Nona was a huge flirt. Okay. She flirted with everybody. She flirted especially with men. She flirted with her doctors right up until the end. So when I was sitting there, trying to have my coffee, there's bees all over the place. I'm sobbing. I've got snot down my face. And here comes this shirtless, good looking, coiffed hair man. And he's just coming by to say, I'm sorry for your loss. And also weirdly, he had seen the digging, which again, I was felt like my Nona was pulling this man to be, with her spirit, this shirtless, very nicely toned, sweaty man. And it just made me laugh because I felt like, we all, I think, experience people, well, I do anyway, have experienced people after they pass. And this was just like a perfectly Nona moment to, shake me up a bit and say, hey, like laugh a little. This is okay. I'm going to bring you a good looking shirtless man. Why don't you write a poem about that? And so, as much as there's grief and loss and sadness in this, I mean, really, her humor, I hope shines through in some of the narrative. And I feel like this poem speaks to that she just was like, here's a little gift for you from me. I'm good. I'm still flirting, have a little flirt with this guy. And I mean, I felt like that moment really just, captured her spirit.
I have to say, going through the collection, you definitely do capture a lot of humor in it.
Good, good.
And like you said, grief as well, there is this great combination of the two, which feels very real. It doesn't feel exaggerative of one way or another of how people react to death, especially death of people who are close to them. It feels,
Mhm.
for me, one of those works where it explores the myriad of emotions that we go through. Of course, the grief, but the resolution, the memories of the good times, and the memories of the not so good times as well.
Mhm.
With that said, this collection I noted feels a bit different from your previous collections of poetry. I'm wondering if you could talk about that a little bit and how the writing process or the final product was different from your perspective than perhaps your previous collections.
Great question. Well, first, I need to say thank you, thank you, thank you to my editor extraordinaire, Abigail Rollins from Palimpsest Press. Palimpsest Press. She really helped me kind of handle that. And I think the main thing that is different, besides the themes, which I always write about love, I always write about women, I always write about family, like those themes, something, those are always what I write about. But the layer of grief and love in connection with loss and family and that is a little bit different. But I think the main word that comes to my mind is maturity. I feel like I matured a lot as a writer doing this. One, because of the themes and what I was going through as a human being, and it helped me on my own spiritual journey and matured me in that way. Um, but also in the revision and editing process. I mean, like I said, the poems as they began are, if they've made it through to the end, some of them are completely different. Voice change, space on the page change. Like we just did so much revision to it to take it out of that kind of space of sort of desperation and anger. And maybe that's immaturity, I don't know. But moving it into this other kind of space. And I really worked hard to find that kind of new voice within myself. Now, don't get me wrong, I still love to write poems about sex and, write poems that are just filled with kind of goofy, funny things and are super immature. That part of my writing voice is still very much alive, but it really didn't fit in here. And if there is humor in it and goofiness, it's coming from my Nona. And I was very conscious of that. I wanted to make sure that people felt that, part of who I am, that goofy, flirty, kind of funny gal, is directly descended from this beautiful woman who is my Nona. So yeah, people will definitely notice the difference in the voice from my other collections of poetry and this one. And I'm okay with that. I'm happy with that. It needed to happen.
As you said, working through this book also helped you in a way with the grieving process for your grandmother. I'm wondering, for anyone else who's experiencing a loss of a loved one in their own life or has experienced that loss, would you recommend writing, creating works as a way to deal with that grief? And if so, where would you recommend for people to start?
That's a great question. And my answer is resounding yes. I think a great place to start is um, in some sort of handwritten way in a journal. You can call it a diary, you can call it a journal, you can get a notebook from the Dollarama or whatever. But writing with your hand for sure is key. There's a connection that happens that's different than typing on a computer. Also, you have sort of a different kind of privacy um, that you have in a book, that you can put it somewhere if you don't want anybody to see it or anything like that. But yeah, I would recommend just writing out your feelings. It sounds sort of like basic therapy, but really, like I said, writing out, like I wrote some nasty, mean, horrible stuff when I was really angry and at the height of my grieving. But I needed somewhere to put that. I didn't want to say it out loud to people. I didn't want to hurt anybody, but I was hurting. And so just the simple act of getting it out of my body, writing it down, um, I think enabled me to move through it. And so I would say for that reason alone, getting it out of your body onto a paper. If you need to write a letter, a hate letter, an anger letter, you don't have to send it. You can rip it up, you can burn it. Like there's so many beautiful sort of letting go practices that you can do if you want to go that far. Um, but for me, it's about this body is like a container of everything, right? It's blood, it's bones, but it's also emotions and all the different ways that we feel. And sometimes there's just too much. Um, and by some miracle, I learned that when I was really a young kid, that there's a place to take it out of you. There's a place to put these things that you don't understand or that you don't want to deal with or that you don't know how to deal with. And for me, that was writing it down on a piece of paper. So I don't know. I think if you're feeling like you're going to explode, let yourself explode in a very natural, safe way that is writing it out on a piece of paper. And then you can decide what you want to do with it afterwards.
And I've heard recommendations very similar to that. Even if you just want to express something,
Yeah,
starting just a small writing piece a day and just going through that whole process, even if you don't plan on showing anyone it, just the
absolutely.
whole point of expressing it.
Yeah, and I mean, I've read so many books on creativity, and every single one I've read, there's a section on waking up and doing like a morning page, writing before you go to sleep, writing a gratitude journal. I mean, there are a million new ways to journal nowadays. Bullet journals, field journals, diet journals, all of those things. I mean, writing things down is a huge part of our culture and a huge part of the way we communicate. And so I think that's part of like the natural expression of ourselves is to write stuff down. I mean, and everywhere you look, there's words. I mean, ads are made of words. There's probably going to be a graphic or something on this that says Windsor Public Library. I mean, there's words everywhere. So it's part of who we are. It's part of who we speak. It's part of our language. It's part of how we communicate. I don't know who said it, but whoever said you are your words, is a master. And I really believe in that. And you are your words that are in here, and you are your words that are out here. And sometimes these words need to come out. So this in here can kind of fill up with other stuff or breathe or reflect, and just take the time. The other thing too is time, right? Like everything happens so fast. People see something, they grab their phone, they tweet immediately or they retweet immediately. There's no time for stopping and reflecting. And I feel like finding a pen, finding a piece of paper, right? That could be all the time it takes for you to kind of shift that initial emotion into something that might be a little less heavy or hurtful or whatever.
Now, speaking of writing, you mentioned that you're on a certain project right now, a poem a day project. Perhaps you could describe that for our audience, for anyone who may not be familiar with that process and what that means for you in your practice.
Sure. It's exactly sort of built on and motivated by the practice of writing poetry. Because this new collection is coming out, I sort of felt a stop in my production of poetry because I was revising and working on this collection. And I really felt like my energy and chemistry was different. And I stopped and was like, why do I feel so weird? And I was like, oh, because I haven't written a poem in like 3 months because I'm just working on these ones. So at the end of last year, I started writing poetry again. It was really difficult actually, to write again, after my nonna passed and after we had kind of finished, and the book was out to the publisher, like done all the edits. I was tired and I was sad. So I cried a lot. And also, this pandemic swelled and it was just really hard to get back to writing. I did not want to write about the pandemic, any of that. I was writing a lot in my journal, which is just for me. But anyway, I kind of built up my courage at the end of December and thought I want to make myself accountable for writing one poem every day. So it's the first thing that I do after like I get up and get dressed and handle with the kids. But it's the first thing that I do every day. And so sometimes I look out the window when I'm inspired. Sometimes I pick up another book of poetry and I'm inspired. The whole month of February, for Black History Month, I focused on a Black person in our community or in the world. And so I did a lot of research, and I learned so much, and it felt really good to sort of connect in that way. March 8th on Monday was International Women's Day. So I wrote a poem about a Canadian Inuit artist. So sometimes I'm motivated by like a national day of some sort. Um, but really, I just sort of see what my heart wants to say. Sometimes it's quiet and it takes a while to figure out what I want to write. Those are usually the days when I've written a haiku because they're only 3 lines. It's a little bit easier. Um, but yeah, it's just the practice of writing, quick edit and revision, and also the added bonus of sharing it and putting it out into the world, which for me, I was feeling very nervous about. And I mean, I always really have anxiety about it. And I kind of want to figure out how to deal with that better, my anxiety of sharing my work. Um, that is like of being afraid of maybe the way that someone might receive it in a way that I hadn't intended, or just how it plays in the world. And so I knew this would be a really good challenge for me to force myself to put my words out there and start kind of building my confidence up in that way, especially since this new book is coming out and I'm going to be reading and sharing things. And like, it makes me nervous. It gives me a lot of anxiety. I get emotional about it. I'm really happy that I haven't cried during this interview. I had a lump a couple times, but I swallowed it down. I got my tea. Not that there's anything wrong with crying or being emotional, but certainly it's something that I'm always working on. So all for all of those reasons, that's why I'm doing a poem a day for the year. And then I'm going to have all these poems at the end of the year that I can decide what I want to do with. I don't know. I'm sure there's a new book in there somewhere. We'll see what happens.
Exactly. You'll have so much to work with.
Yeah.
Now, not to give you any anxiety right now, but on the topic of sharing a poem, I'm wondering if you could share another reading from Thimbles.
Sure, sure. Okay. The wrinkle between her eyebrows deepens when she cooks. It gathers into the place of the concentration of service, of timing, of salt, of pepper, of butter, of garlic, and spills onto her cheeks and into roses and the crystal wine glass a palm's grasp near. She sips down whispers of complaint, pausing only to church, to sew, to bathroom, to sleep, then back to the service dance. Drunk, heavy faced roses, sullen, pull down from her roots, contaminated by everyone else's needs. All those years I watched without knowing, absorbing her actions as perfection, unaware of what she gave up to give us. I weep for her spirit, for the strength it takes to cook in that kind of kitchen. So this is kind of an example of a piece where I'm like starting to realize, she wasn't always um, cleanly happy, for lack of a better way to describe it. She she had hardships to deal with every day, um, and just her life was about service to her family, service as a seamstress for all of her jobs. I mean, she grew up, or she was a mother in the 50s, when typically the woman stayed home, but
Mhm.
she worked a full-time job. She never stayed home to raise the kids. She and my grandfather both worked, and I mean that in itself for that time, of our lives culturally, was unheard of, but she did it. She got up, took care of the kids, and went to work, worked full time, came home, cooked for everybody, and her weekends were cleaning and cooking and more cooking and ironing. And like, she ironed my nono's underwear and his handkerchiefs. Like, that's crazy town. But just considering every morning waking up and knowing that your day is going to be about everybody else, and doing that with as much love and spirit and joy as she could give every day. So yeah, it's uh, I got angry when I started realizing that, but I also wanted to shift out of that and say, well, what can we learn from this, and how can I um, give her respect and pay her respects, for all the service that she did for us. And that's also what's built into this is my sort of thank you to her for what she gave us her whole life.
I think it really does come across as well, not only in that piece, but I think throughout the book as well. Of course, we're talking about Thimbles, the newest collection by Vanessa Shields, who's joining us here for this conversation. We are going to have it available at the Windsor Public Library along with your other
Yeah.
publications. If people want to get their hands on their own copy of Thimbles, can you talk a little bit about its release and where they would be able to find it?
Sure. So right now it's available for pre-order through the Palimpsest Press website, which is palimpsestpress.ca, or you can go to vanessashields.com and it's just splattered all over my website. So the book is currently being printed, so we don't have any physical copies yet, but we're taking pre-orders. So that's one way to get it. Otherwise, it will be at the library in all your local bookstores. You'll always be able to purchase it online from the Palimpsest Press website. The virtual launch is Thursday, April 29th at 7:30 Eastern Standard Time. We have to like start saying now, where in the world the time is.
Yes.
So I don't know what all the configurations of time are in the rest of the world. We will figure that out for Canada at least, but 7:30 Eastern Standard Time on Thursday, April 29th. And it's going to be hosted by Karis Cotter, who is a dear friend of mine. She writes children's middle grade books and ghost stories, and she lives in Western Bay, Newfoundland. So she's going to be on with us Zooming, and there's going to be a special video presentation, and there's going to be discussion and a Q&A, and it's going to be super fun and interactive. And I'm going to be signing books live. So if you pre-order a book, but you want me to sign it for you at the opening or at the virtual launch, then I'll be doing that there too. So April 29th, 7:30, save the date. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Vanessa. And just one more thing. This is coinciding with April, so it will be coinciding with National Poetry Month.
Right. Yep.
And of course, a great way to celebrate that is by reading amazing poets. Of course, you can always go to local bookstores, peruse through local presses, and of course, the Windsor Public Library. My question for you is, are there any particular poets you would recommend for people to check out?
I just am 3 poems shy of finishing Jude Neil's collection called The River Answers, I believe. Jude Neil is a poet from out west, and she just had her book launch a couple of weeks ago. And it's sort of resilience poems, poems about nature, poems about life. There's a lot of poems in there about like pandemic life, which is really interesting. Um, I just was gifted Rupi Kaur's new book called Homebody, which I haven't opened yet, but I have that. So that's on my list. I mean, there's so many. If you go to the League of Canadian Poets website, that's a really wonderful place to go to. It's poets.ca. They're fantastic. Also, there's a wonderful place called Poetry in Voice, and you can Google that, and they have contemporary, like dead alive poets, poets from all over the world, from all over time, beautifully collected on their website. That's another great place to go. But if you go in any bookstore or any library, there's probably going to be like a special table or something set up because it's National Poetry Month. So it's not going to be difficult to find poetry in April. But yeah, that's who I'm reading. I love Rosemary Watola Tromer. She writes a poem a day as well. Part of my writing is inspired by her. So I get one of her poems every day in my inbox, and they're just freaking unbelievable. And she and I actually have kind of become, internet friends over the last year. So she's someone who I would recommend. So there's tons. George Eliot Clark. Yeah.
And of course, so many more that aren't even mentioned. So make sure for National Poetry Month, attend your local bookstores, check out local presses, and visit the Windsor Public Library. And speaking of which, on behalf of the Windsor Public Library, I want to thank you so much, Vanessa, for this conversation. And I just want to remind our audiences that at the end of April, you can have a copy of Thimbles, your newest release. Again, it is available for pre-order now and to place holds on for the Windsor Public Library.
Awesome.
Vanessa, thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much. Thank you. Thank you. I should say that Windsor's Poet Laureates too, Marianne Mahern, Marty Gervais, and Samantha Badawa. So those three for sure. Their books are all Hopefully, I know they're in your library and for sure they're at local bookstores too.
Oh, definitely,
Yeah.
yes.